Well, today I continue with a sermon series that I began last week on love. And for later, if you want, the notes from last week are in your bulletin. You can look at them later. But I just want to spend just a second or two just giving you some of the highlights from last week before we move into this week's focus. And it's clear that love impacts more than anything else in our lives. Love affects all that there is. It affects our emotions, affects our relationships, affects how we approach things, affects how we think, affects how we see problems, affects our attitudes, affects everything, affects our neurochemistry. Love just affects everything. And whether or not people realize it, I believe that love has been a determining factor across events of history. And when you get right down to it, love is at the core of the problems that nations have to deal with. Love is at the core of the issues that churches have to deal with. Love is at the core of what we as individuals have to deal with on a day in and day out basis. If you want to understand the core issue of anything, look at where the people or the organization are with love itself. When it's all said and done, there is no more important topic to delve into because love, as I said last week, is the whole deal, the real gig, the bottom line, and the entire shebang, one of my favorite words. So why do I say this? Well, I say it simply because we learn in Scripture that God is love. That's what it says. God is love. The essence of God is love. And when we love means that we are experiencing God himself. And when we love, we are experiencing the presence of God, who is love, within us. And one central way that we know that God is love is expressed in a letter by John, which I talked a lot about last week, who was a close companion of Jesus. John, who really got it. He wrote, "This is how God showed his love for us. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him." God is love. God is the source of love. Love comes from God. The purpose of our lives, the reason we are alive now, the reason we are here in this time and place, is to love. You see, you take away God, there is not only no life, there's no love. No God, no love. It's that simple. Everything hinges on God. And as God is love, everything is dependent upon love. Now, what I didn't get into last week are just some characteristics of God's love, such as that God's love is permanent and eternal. It ain't ever going away. It's lavish, it's deep, it's profound. It remains in place even when we fall short and we blow it. God's love doesn't depend upon a darn thing we do or don't do. God's love is passionate. It's intense, it's fervent, it's zealous, it's devout, it's enthusiastic, boundless, and it's fiery. Read about God throughout Scripture. God is fiery. His love is passionate, and it drives everything God does. And when we understand that God is love, when we spend our lives living through Christ by loving God with all our strength, mind, heart, and soul, and others as ourselves, then our lives are in alignment with why we are alive to begin with. And we discover the purpose of all. Jesus was very clear. In essence, he said, when you spend your lives, however imperfectly you do it, working toward loving God with all you have and all you are and loving people in the same way, you've gotten the whole point. The whole deal. You got it. And Jesus said on top of that, this whole thing we call Scripture, it can be summed up in that way. Love God, love people, that's it. That's the whole thing. Now it's clear that regardless of our faults and faux pas, that when we love God and people, or work toward that, it changes everything. Our perspectives, our actions that we take or don't take, our feelings, our relationships, how we live out each day, from the time we wake up till the time our heads hit the pillow, our interactions with others, how we see challenges, the decisions we make, our priorities, how we define success. Everything shifts when our life is about love. And while last week I explored and just touched on some definitions of love, this morning what I want to do is I want to look at some more nuanced ways of getting at what love is all about. As some of you are familiar with this, some of you are not, but English has a word love, and it really doesn't do the word love justice. The Greeks got it. They have lots of words for love, and they had 4, in fact, major words to describe a variety of different nuances about what love is about. And the more that you and I understand, and the more that you and I act or not act upon different kinds of love, the healthier our lives become, the more joyful and peaceful and purposeful. One mistake that we sometimes make is to think that love is an all or nothing or one-dimensional deal. And that just leads to heartache. So let's get into the different kinds and nuances of love. One kind of love is reflected in the Greek word eros. It means romantic sexual love. It's where we get the word erotic. It's passionate, physically expressed love. It's sensual. It's love that desires and wants, has to do with excitement and pleasure and satisfaction. Eros is a kind of love, as one person says, may give a little, but the motive is always to get something back. Eros can be selfish, self-centered, reflect self-absorption. Now, eros isn't bad. It just needs to be managed and recognized for what it is and what it is not. Eros in a committed relationship that is characterized by mutuality in the other kinds of love I'm going to talk about is a God-given gift. Eros, however, waxes and wanes. This is why building a relationship on a foundation of eros is a risky endeavor. Passionate love is fickle, and its intensity, by definition, is not constant, nor is it stable. Well, another kind of love is represented by the Greek word storge, S-T-O-R-G-E, storge, and this is a love that binds people together. It connects families and communities. It's about affection. It comes from familiarity. And storge happens when we feel comfortable and secure being in the presence of another and a group of people. It's when we feel that just being with the other person isn't enough. That's a kind of storge. It is a love that often will overlook faults and give people slack and can be forgiving because it has affection at its roots. It has to do with fondness. You might even say that people in a close-knit neighborhood have storge for each other. Yet there are limits to it. It ain't unconditional. And then there's filial love, platonic love, brotherly love, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, platonic love. It's the love of friends. It's the love we have for another when we share interests and core values and talents. C.S. Lewis wrote that he thought that the love between David and his friend Jonathan in the Bible was an example of filial, deep, committed love, friendship. It's the love of very close friends, great pals. It's a love that appreciates and gives and takes and gives and takes and shares. But filial love can be conditional. Because if a person acts in a selfish or not giving or harsh way, filial love can come to an end. And then finally, there's the Greek word for a kind of love called agape. Agape shows up well over 100 times in the New Testament. Why? Because it's a big deal, and it reflects the most expansive, giving, sacrificial love there is. Agape is a love that happens regardless. It's a no ifs, no buts, no ands love. It's not ever conditional. It's not I love you if, or I love you because. It is I love you, period. Agape does not expect anything in return. It's a committed no matter what love. It's self-sacrificial. It puts others before ourselves, puts others' interests and needs first. It is the highest form and expression of love. It's the greatest love of all. And in the first letter of John, where it says that God is love, what it says is God is agape. God is the most extraordinary, limitless, unconditional, unbounded, intense, sacrificing love there is. God acted upon agape when he sent Jesus to us. Jesus demonstrated agape when he died on the cross for us. Jesus showed agape when he was taking his last breaths and he said, "Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And agape, my friends, is not something that we as human beings can either will to happen or have within ourselves to any degree without God. You see, the only way we partially experience, the only way we can strive to act upon agape is when we have the agape love of God within us. When we feel and take agape actions, it's because of God's agape working through us. We are the vehicle, the vessel for that to happen. Agape is a verb. It's a love that does. And it can only come from God. Our reading today, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. How many of you ever attended a wedding? How many of you hear this reading at virtually every wedding? What most people don't know when they hear this, though, is that when Paul is talking about love in this letter, he's talking precisely about agape. Something that is not from human origin, but from God within. Imagine if couples saw their love and the love that sustained their relationship was only something that could happen from the power of God. Paul's letter describes what agape in action looks like. It's powerful. It's potent. It's humbling. And I don't mean to be cynical, but I think at most wedding receptions, before the first sip of champagne is taken, they don't know what they just heard. God is agape. Agape is patient, kind, does not envy or boast, is not easily angered, does not keep a record of wrongs, does not delight in evil, embraces truth, trusts God, always hopes, always perseveres. How is a human being capable of that without the agape of God working through us? We've got to have the agape love of God within us. How else is it possible for any human being to always trust, always hope, always persevere 24/7 no matter what? Such a stance can only come from God acting through us. Agape is just so extraordinary. Well, as agape is the penultimate kind of love, it's important just quickly to take a look at what it is and what it is not. We're not God. We're not agape. Therefore, we can't love like God. But Christ working through us can move us in that direction. And Christ clearly calls us, as he said to his followers, keep agape front and center in your minds, hearts, and actions. Agape, when we experience it, doesn't make us feel powerful. We feel humble. Now, agape doesn't mean that anything goes and everything's okay. We don't let our kids run out into the streets. We don't say to other people that we love, do whatever you want in your life. That's not agape. And certainly agape is not about allowing ourselves to be harmed or hurt or destroyed by other human beings. God, I do not believe, calls us to express agape by being hung on a cross. Jesus did that. We don't need to do that. Agape doesn't mean we stay in a relationship that's toxic, that leads to our destruction. God can stay in that relationship with that person we may not be called to be. Agape is never manipulative or used to control others. A controlling love is not agape. That might be eros, but it's not agape. And we need to recognize that with this whole topic that there are different kinds of love and subtle nuances between various kinds of love, and that while agape is appropriate in any relationship, other kinds of love like eros are not. What kind of love are we talking about, we need to think. Now I want to conclude today briefly by just quickly looking at some ways, some not so pleasant ways, some hard ways in which human beings have reacted to love over the course of history. And one of the best places to look is Scripture itself. Do you know that sometimes people try and limit love? Put boundaries around it, circumscribe it, say what's acceptable, what's not, who's in, who's out. Look at what happened to Jesus. He healed a man with leprosy. Why? He loved him. He frequently sat down and shared meals with those who were most broken. Why? Because he loved them. He spent time with those who could not cut it by society standards. Why? He loved them. He responded to the needs of a woman everybody thought was terrible. Why? He loved her. He reached out to those who were disdained and in the minority and far out of the margins of what the culture was comfortable with. Why? Because he loved them. He was compassionate and tried to convince those who thought they had no need for God to turn back to God. Why? Because he loved them. The bottom line is, if you look at the life of Christ, he crossed every single line of comfort to go to where the pain, the hurt, the heartache, the suffering, and being lost was the greatest. The more love, the more agape he showed to those who were disliked, rejected, and considered to be outliers, the more those who felt on the inside tried to limit his love. And what is striking to me and so tragic and sad is that frequently it was those who considered themselves to be the most religious, most righteous, most had their hands on what their religion meant, who tried to limit the love of Jesus the most. Some things don't change, do they? But in addition to trying to limit love, sometimes people would walk away from the love of God. I think of the story of a man who had absolutely everything. He had all possessions, all wealth, all security, all power, but deep within him, he felt something is missing in my life. And so he meets Jesus. And Jesus tried to overcome this man's hurdles and obstacles and pains by loving him. And Jesus talked to the man about the condition of his heart and why he felt something was missing. The story is not ultimately about money or wealth. It's about the love that was missing in the man's life and what was getting in the way of that love. And he walked away from Jesus. You might even say he walked away from agape. And there are those still who continue to walk away from the love of God, including me sometimes in my own journey of faith. Sometimes people respond to love with fear. One day Jesus went down by the Sea of Galilee, and there he sees Peter fishing. He gets into a boat. He begins to teach. When he finished speaking, he told Peter to throw his net onto the other side of the boat, which Peter did, and he caught more fish than he could have conceived of. Peter said, "Get away from me, Jesus." And what's really interesting is, you know what Jesus' response is to Peter? Peter, don't be afraid. Jesus was God in the flesh. God is love. Jesus was love, is love. And I believe Peter was extraordinarily overwhelmed by God's love at that moment for a variety of reasons, including not feeling worthy to receive that love. Peter was fearful. And then finally, lastly, some people in response to love want to kill it. Jesus was beaten, forced to carry his own cross, ridiculed, nailed to a cross, and died. You might even see that when they killed Jesus, they were trying to kill off the love of God because Jesus was God in the flesh. They tried to kill love. But it didn't happen, did it? Easter morning, love broke out. And isn't it horrendously obvious to all of us here today that there are those in the world who still are trying to rid the world of love? We know there are those who kill in the name of religion. In all religions. Across all history, every faith tradition has been responsible for killing. And the problem is that when that happens, they forget who God is. God is agape. And sometimes people have lives that are being used by evil itself to kill love, because evil is the opposite of love. Well, next week I'm going to get into a bunch of things. I'm going to get into how it is that we strive to make our lives more about agape. How do we do that? What can get in the way of that, of being receptive to the love of God? How can we be more about agape in our relationships? How can this chapel be more about agape? And we'll get into that. But what I want to invite you to do, as I did last week, is just some things to think about this week. I invite you to join me in thinking about and praying about and pondering these 4 kinds of love I talked about. Eros, storge, filial love, agape. What do these things mean to you? Where are you with them? How do they express themselves? How do you relate to them, react to them, respond to them? Think about the nuances of these types of love and where you are in your relationship with others. Think and pray about your own reactions to love in your life, not only from the love of God, but from the love of others. Are there ways that you try and limit the love of God, or walk away from God, or you're afraid of love? Why and how? So a lot to think about and a lot more to get into next week. And so I'd like to invite Paul just to play for a few moments as we just think and invite God into our minds and our hearts and think about this whole topic of